Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
What should you be reading this summer, and how should you be reading it?
It's so easy to misread a book, a movie, or a TV show.
How can we learn to get them right?
This is a story of boy meets girl.
What is fiction good for if it doesn't give you a happy ending and a simple moral takeaway?
The boy, Tom Hanson of Margate, New Jersey, grew up believing that he'd never truly be happy until the day he met the one. This belief stemmed from early exposure to sad British pop music and a total misreading of the movie The Graduate.
We're often told that fictions give us entertainment, escapism, and lessons about life. But what about the ones that don't?
Have we forgotten how to read?
The world is full of challenging, brilliant, sophisticated works of fiction. How can we let them give us all they have to offer?
Summer reading and misreading.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
Hey, philosopher, thanks for downloading this episode of Philosophy Talk.
And thanks so much for being our partner. You've supported us in the past, and we're really grateful for that support. But we need your help now more than ever.
So here's what you do. Go to our website, philosophytalk.org, click the donate button, and help us make more of what we know you love.
Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.
And thank you for donating.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're here at the studios of KALW San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus, where Ken teaches philosophy and I direct the Philosophy and Literature Initiative.
Today, it's our annual summer misreading show.
We're taking a step back from the bookshelves to ask whether there's a right way, or at least a smarter way, to read sophisticated fiction.
Later in the program, we'll talk to Maryanne Wolf from UCLA, author of Proust and the Squid, about the neuroscience of reading.
We'll also ask Pavel from the University of Chicago about how genre informs the way we read and misread works of fiction.
And we'll talk to one of our featured bloggers, the philosopher Antonia Peacocke, about what she calls reader's block.
But to get us started, we sent our roving philosophical reporter, Nina Gensler-Debs, to find out how we can read our way to better forms of attention. She files this report.
Open up almost any publication between June and August, and you're likely to see summer reading recommendations, from frothy romance novels to thrillers to thick biographies. It turns out that this concept, that summer is a great time to read, has been around for over 100 years and is tied to another idea that came about around the same time: vacation. Before the 19th century, it was mostly the wealthy who could afford to go on getaways. But after World War I, vacation became more available to American middle and working class people. A post-war boom meant that travel-related industries started to flourish: oil companies, car companies, and motels. At the same time, progressive employers started to be persuaded that giving their workers time off would lead to better and more efficient work. More holidays meant more time for people to read. And now, summer reading is a firmly established tradition.
If something's interesting to me, I actually have a hard time not reading it.
While she likes the idea of time to read, artist and writer Jenny Odell rejects the concept that we should think of our time in terms of maximizing productivity. And so, she recently wrote a book called How to Do Nothing, and tried to do two things. First, to critique technology, mainly social media, and the financial incentives those companies have to keep you anxiously engaged.
And then two was my interest in bioregionalism and coming to inhabit a place more thoughtfully, kind of in more detail, to feel like you're kind of part of something. So it's kind of my invitation to the reader to kind of wander away in a similar direction.
Jenny's book was one of my favorites this spring, so I decided to ask her for some of her summer reading recommendations. Books that aren't necessarily about taking you to a far-off place, but about looking at where you are now with a new perspective.
They were all kind of books that set me on a path toward discovering some kind of segment of my physical environment that it turned out was very ignorant about. Like, each book was like sort of a gateway drug, I guess, for becoming interested in what's around me.
The first book Jenny recommended is Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram. Abram is a philosopher and cultural ecologist, and in his book, he examines the way humans perceive and communicate with each other and our environment.
Reading that was the first time I thought about other kinds of language besides verbal or like human expressive language. Just the other day, I was in the rose garden and the birds are all singing. And at this point, I now hear individual species and it has like some meaning to me. And I was just like, what did I used to hear like when I came here?
As you might be able to guess, Jenny is a bird watcher. Although, as she says in her book, half, if not more, of bird watching is actually bird listening. And she said that The Genius of Birds by Jennifer Ackerman was the book that really made her appreciate the intelligence of birds.
In terms of like using tools and being able to recognize human faces and communicate that information to others, that was the book that prompted me to make friends with a couple of crows on my street that I have now known for 3 years. They will even recognize me if I'm like a block from my apartment, and they'll kind of like land near me expecting a peanut.
Jenny's third book recommendation is one she says she is indebted to. Braiding Sweetgrass was written by ecological scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer. In the book, Kimmerer writes about different living beings, from squash to salamanders, and explains that more ecological consciousness will show the ways humanity benefits from a reciprocal relationship with the natural world.
The thing that I'm the most impressed by is just how she so skillfully and so poetically weaves together indigenous knowledge, weaving that together with Western science, because she has a background in both.
Kimmerer is also a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. One chapter of the book focuses on a study on the decline of sweetgrass, a plant that was important on multiple levels for her ancestors. It turns out that sweetgrass is dying because it's being under-harvested by humans.
It had co-evolved with human practices of harvesting, and those practices had in turn evolved to help the plant. So you could argue it's literally dying of lack of attention. And then, of course, we ourselves are threatened by our own lack of attention to these kinds of things.
In 1872, the Chicago Tribune published a list of summer book recommendations. They suggested that the best summer book is one that
the idler can take with him into solitude and read with delightful pauses, when with indolent finger upon the page, his eye wanders up some green vista, or catches some view of the distant sea, and his ear is soothed with the distant murmur of the winds and waves.
Maybe, while reading one of these books, you'll hear the distant murmur of the waves, or maybe you'll look up and see a hawk flying overhead. Either way, take it as an opportunity to consider where you're directing your attention, and whether you might take Jenny Odell's invitation to wander away towards something different. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Nina Gensler-Debs.
Thanks for that excellent report, Nina. I'm Josh Landy. With me is my Stanford colleague Ken Taylor, and you're listening to our annual summer reading show.
Josh, there's something that's really been bothering me. I teach freshmen how to read philosophy. I don't expect them to have learned much about how to read philosophy in high school, but I even give them a lot of literature. And it seems to me they don't even know how to read literature. And this was really brought on to, and it's not just my students. What really got me going, I hate to admit, I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan. I love the TV series, but I hadn't read the books, and it prompted me to start. I'm now reading the book, so that's my summer reading.
Right.
But the thing that really got me going was how many people misread Daenerys Targaryen.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, so look, I was reading these things along the way, and she was supposed to be some kind of feminist icon, and I'm thinking, no, she's not a feminist hero. She's got this absolute will to power. And we're told the story of how that will to power grows and grows and grows. So they misread her as some kind of feminist icon rather than a growing tyrant who starts from nothing.
Or to put the same point differently, I mean, she's a complicated figure. Because, I mean, maybe it's not even as simple as saying she's either a feminist icon or a growing tyrant. Maybe she's a bit of both. I mean,
yes.
She is a strong female character. And some of the things she does are admirable. But some of the things she does are despicable and troubling.
This is like a very tragic story.
Right.
It's deeply tragic, not in an Aristotelian sense, more like a Shakespearean tragedy, right? Where the world is a tragic place and human agency is inadequate to the challenges that it's given, and these things that we most desire and dream of are unachievable. And I had this what I thought was an insight. The Iron Throne is to the Game of Thrones as the Ring of Power is to the Lord of Rings, right? In the Lord of the Rings, the Ring of Power must be destroyed. It cannot be worn by anyone. Even the people you most love and worship, it cannot be worn. It brings everything to ruin. The Iron Throne does the same thing. What happens to the Ring of Power? It gets destroyed. And would you have rooted for Frodo to end up with the Ring of Power? No, right? So why would you root for Daenerys to end up with the Iron Throne.
I love what you're saying, Ken. That's such a beautiful analogy. And, it's funny. I mean, this show even gives us a tiny little glimpse along the way of a different way of being, a different way of willing, as Schopenhauer would say. You've got this lovely little vignette of Arya Stark with the faceless man, and he tells her to basically to become no one. To us, it sounds potentially negative.
Yeah.
But what if it is a tragic world in which ultimately the best thing is for no one to occupy the throne? The best thing is for people to abandon these absurd ambitions that are destroying everything, have more moderate desires, maybe not become no one, but become a little bit less.
Here's what Daenerys was. She was about the charisma of tyranny. It's exactly what you're saying. She is both deeply charismatic and tyrannical at the same time. That's a disturbing thought, right? Because suppose you were like one of Hitler's, taken in by Hitler, like Martin Heidegger was in the early days. Taken in by his charisma, taken in by his promise to rebuild Germany, taken in by his, remake a new nation. And you were at one of his rallies and you were stirred, and this nation was going to be lifted up from nothing. And then you realized, oh my God, this is where this leads. That's a disturbing thought, right? Some people think literature shouldn't disturb you like that. I'm thinking, shouldn't we celebrate the power of literature to disturb you like that?
I think we absolutely should. I think that's the thing that worries me about the current cultural moment as far as reading fiction is concerned and watching fiction, that I think people are too often looking for fictions that kind of reconfirm their existing belief structure. Whereas, there's a long tradition of great writers and great philosophers saying, that's not really the function of literature. That's fine. It's a good thing, of course, for us to have beliefs and to articulate them, to talk to each other. But literature is to do something else, right? I mean, maybe it's to transfigure suffering, as Nietzsche thought, and make it something we can live with. Or maybe it's to spur our emotions in some kinds of way. People like Wordsworth and Tolstoy and John Stuart Mill thought. But yeah, maybe it's what you say in some cases, to shake us up out of our certainties.
Right. It's something deep in human nature. It's not really about the cultural moment. We read literature, we watch fiction, we look for rooting interest, right?
Right.
And here's what we think. We think the rooting interest is the moral center. Sometimes the maker of fiction does a trick on you, makes you, invites you, compels you to root for a character who is not the moral center. That's what Game of Thrones does. That's what I think Three Billboards.
Three Billboards, fantastic example.
Fantastic example of the person that you feel compelled to root for is not.
They're not morally perfect.
Yes,
they're not morally perfect.
Not only are they not morally, they're deeply morally problematic.
Right.
And that's why people thought when she had a reconciliation with the racist cop, they thought the racist cop is thereby redeemed.
But
that's
no,
not what
he's
it was
not
saying
redeemed at all. Right.
Exactly. Right. And then there's this other thing, that this is really our culture moment. This is one of the reasons we've gotten rid of the great books and the canon and all that sort of stuff, because we're looking for affirmation of ourselves in what we read. And so he said, where are all the black people? Where are all the gay people? Where are all the women in all these old dead books, right? Mm-hmm. So we're thinking, we don't want to read those anymore. Not because they don't have anything to say, because they don't affirm us, right? So if we're looking for affirmation, if we collapse the moral center with the rooting interest, and those two things work together, we're going to misread tons of literature.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I particularly like your first point about, looking for this rooting interest. I mean, so often works of great literature, great movies, great TV shows present us with these very fraught, morally complicated people who are doing some things well and some things really badly. And unfortunately, if we live in an environment that's telling us the only thing you can do with fiction is look to it for examples of good behavior or bad behavior to avoid and lessons about life, well, what are we going to do with these complicated people? We know what we're going to say. We're going to say that's a bad TV show. That's a bad film. It's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Because we're being told to emulate the main character.
Exactly.
But that's not the right way of thinking about it. Kundera has this lovely line. He says, suspending moral judgment's not the immorality of the novel, it's its morality. I'm going to invite you to judge these characters right from the first 10 minutes. And guess what? You're going to turn out to be wrong. And then you're going to form a new judgment, and guess what? You're wrong again.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's the morality of the novel.
Yes, and then when you're done, I'm going to ask you to judge your darn self, right?
Exactly.
And gain some moral self-knowledge.
And this is what's on offer from things like Game of Thrones
exactly.
and Three Billboards and Hamlet and a bunch of other things.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. It's our annual summer reading show.
Coming up, Does reading change our brain? And which is better, reading on the page or reading on the screen?
Reading, misreading, and the brain, when Philosophy Talk continues. Welcome back. It's the annual summer reading edition of Philosophy Talk. I'm Ken Taylor, here with my Stanford colleague and co-host, Josh Landy.
We're joined now by Maryanne Wolf. She's director of the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA. And she's the author of several books on the neuroscience of reading, including Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain. Maryanne, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
It's a pleasure.
So look, Maryanne, we're thinking about reading and misreading and the nature of reading, and you bring a unique perspective to this as a neuroscientist. So tell me, what does reading actually do to the brain?
The first thing to understand is that genetically, none of us were ever born to read. We don't have a single genetic program for reading the way we do for oral language, vision, all the different senses and motoric activities and other cognitive activities, nothing for reading. But what we do have is a brain that can make new circuits for new invented cognitive and linguistic activities by the species. So what reading does is create a new circuitry inside every individual literate person's brain, and that is a circuit that reflects the writing system, the educational background, how much the person has read, and even the medium. The circuitry is going to reflect the characteristics or affordances of the different mediums. When we first read, we have a very basic circuit. We can all read at a level that is more like a third or fourth grader. But what reading enables us to do is begin a geometric progression of intelligence. And that's what we give our children and our literate beings around the world.
So it's a kind of exponential growth in our capacities. As we read, we get better at reading. As we get better at reading, we get better at processing a whole bunch of other things, right? I mean, you've talked about our the increase in what psychologists call theory of mind, right? So we get better at entering imaginatively into the perspective of another person. You've talked about us learning about ourselves and having this expanding repertoire of emotions and a repertoire of story forms to draw on. I mean, it seems like the affordances of literacy are virtually endless.
They certainly seem infinite, but what I want to emphasize is that as we learn to read fluently with comprehension, we enter a new phase of reading, and that's as important for everyone to understand as anything else. In literature, we often call it close reading. In my work, I call it deep reading, when we can now allocate time to the perspective-taking dimension, the empathy, how we literally learn to enter the lives, the historical epochs, the different cultures that we are first beginning to be introduced to in our reading. And that becomes a foundation for ever better understanding of alternative ideas. And that's really one of the hallmarks of civilization, our ability to begin to have that foundation at a personal level and at a cultural level being given to all our literate individuals from epoch to epoch.
So the work we do when we read, as opposed to other forms of consumption of a narrative, like, say, watching a movie, right? The work we do in reading is really different than the work we do in just listening to a story told orally, or probably to a story presented in a filmic way. And because of these new modes of communicating things to people, I think reading is on the decline.
Reading of that special kind, the kind that involves intense attention and deep understanding.
Right. So I wonder what you think about that. I mean, is something cognitive lost in the transition?
Well, what we are doing now is studying, and I'm part of an e-read network in Europe as well. We're studying what happens when we have the same exact information, but we are using different mediums. And in this case, there was a meta-analysis by the e-read network of 52 studies since 2000 that compared what young adults would do when they were asked questions about something they read, the very same content, in a book or on a screen. And what we found is that between 2000 and 2017, over 171,000 subjects, they are better at truly comprehending the information when it's done in print, in a book. Now, the question that you and any listener would say, but what about as we get closer to the true digital native to 2017? And here my colleagues did a sub-analysis, and what they find is that the closer we are to the present, to 2017, the greater the superiority effect is for the printed form, the book, the novella. And here we get, there's two things I want to say. First, we know from a sub-study by some of our Israeli colleagues like Rakefet Ackerman that those digital natives believe they're doing better on the screen because they say, but I can do it faster. The reality is that skimming is the new norm, and there's a San Jose researcher who is doing some of that work. But what we're showing is that when you skim, you do not allocate sufficient time to critical analysis.
I wanted you to tell me about another comparison, because it's not just that people read the same stuff, but they read it online. They read less, and they consume more stories and content by watching video, by watching a person or people telling a story or enacting a story. Could the video presentation of narrative content engage your brain in a superior way or an inferior way than the printed presentation of narrative content?
The beauty of reading is that it gives us what we call in cognitive terms recursion. We are rarely conscious of it, but when we think about what we're reading, we are able to check ourselves, to monitor, to develop our own imaginative schemata.
Because we have the time.
Because we are allocating time. These
because
are
if you're watching,
milliseconds.
If you're watching a TV episode, for example.
You cannot, recursion is impossible.
Right.
You don't go back. And even in audiobooks, which I find have their own wonderful contribution, you have one of the same problems. You cannot, or you can, but you do not go back to do what is one part of the critical analysis, which is to check yourself, to check your thought. And the skimming in the digital formats, whether we're talking in video format or digital screen reading, we don't go back to check ourselves, and we don't give enough time for true critical analysis.
That's really fascinating. I mean, I'm completely persuaded by you that we're in a new kind of world now where so much reading is being done on the screen, and this is decreasing people's attention span. People aren't even finishing even just a short article. They'll read, there's the F-shaped reading, right, where you might read the whole of the first line.
Yes.
Right.
And everything looks to people like data. It looks like information, which is very different from the kind of approach that we have when we're reading, for example, a complicated argument in a philosophy book or a beautiful, complex novel. How can we get people back into and get them out of this kind of fast food approach to reading and get them back into a kind of slow, contemplative, reflective, recursive approach?
One of the things that has been troubling me is that there have been several recent studies in which they look at the amount of reading, basically, that our young did in the 70s and early 80s compared to now. And really what you saw was about 65% of the young would read something like a book or a magazine or something every day, and certainly every week. And now it's down to about 16% of our young who are picking up newspapers or journals or books every day. Now, what is simultaneously happening, though, is that they are consuming words, and there have been certain studies that are showing we're actually being bombarded with print and words. So we're not talking about how much they actually have to ingest on a daily basis, but the real question
the quality of reading.
Is the quality. And it begins with the quality of attention. And our young have real differences, and this is one of the things that I'm most worried about in our young children, that they're growing up even in the 0 to 5 period with all these digital devices, that their attention is being bifurcated all the time, and they are literally changing attention before they even go into school and learn to focus. There are gaps, there are chasms in the vocabulary that children are learning, and when they come into kindergarten, so many of our children are either already so far behind. So even when we're talking about our youngest children, there's a social justice aspect to the preparation for reading. What we have when we have a citizenry who is only skimming is that, and at the same time being bombarded with all this information and their attention is being bifurcated all the time, what we have is a recipe for non-thinking citizens who are looking at only those kinds of pieces or silos of information that they're comfortable with.
They're going to be much more vulnerable to propaganda.
They are the most susceptible to false news, false fears, and the false hopes raised by demagogues, whether here or elsewhere.
Maryanne, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and it's really important work that you're doing. And so I really thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was a true pleasure.
Maryanne Wolf, author of Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. It's our annual summer reading show.
Tragedy, comedy, or fantasy? How do you even know what kind of thing you're reading?
We're joined now by Thomas Pavel. He's a professor of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at the University of Chicago, and he's talking to us today from the village of Luxeuil-les-Bains in eastern France. And full disclosure, he was my dissertation advisor, and a great advisor he was too. Thomas, it's such a pleasure to have you on Philosophy Talk.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me too.
So, Thomas, I'm glad you're here. Josh tells me that you're an expert in genre. I don't know if you're a fan of the TV show Game of Thrones. I was a huge fan, and I think that TV show is of a certain genre. It's the end of the era kind of tale. Era is over. The era of the contest for the Iron Throne, and that's going to come to an end. So I decided about season 5 or 6 that nobody could occupy the Iron Throne. It had to be like destroyed. It had to be like melted down or something, and that's what happened. I was right. But many people didn't see that coming, and they were upset by the turn of events. So
They read it as a different genre.
Yeah,
they read it as a redemption narrative or a
on.
return narrative,
Right,
something
redemption
like
or return. That seemed to me what's going on. So I want you to help us think about think about genre, how it shapes reading and the potential for misreading, and where these demands of genre come from, and all that stuff. So what's your first thought about this kind of thing?
The first thought is that when we watch a movie, a TV series, read a book, and so on, we have certain expectations. And these expectations are guided by our knowledge of that this is a comic novel, or this is a picaresque novel, or this is a tragic movie, a comic movie. It's not just that we face novelty and we learn and we are surprised by the suspense. We also recognize certain things. And being aware of what the genre is helps us make less mistakes in this kind of recognition. A genre models, shapes the kind of action, the kind of feelings, and also the kind of ending.
So, in fact, our understanding of what the genre is, or our guess as to what the genre is of a work of fiction, helps us to enjoy it. I mean, presumably, it would be very hard to enjoy a tragedy if you thought it was a comedy. These jokes aren't funny.
Yeah.
God, what a downer ending!
Definitely, it shapes you. Have the right expectations and the pleasure of recognizing what you expected to happen, you see. Also, they shape the moral issues and the moral feelings involved in it.
But, Thomas, that presupposes that you know and that you can recognize the genre. But where does a story come with, I am of this genre? I mean, back to my recognition of the Game of Thrones, I came to the realization or the suspicion that this is how it has to end, with that era decisively closed off. It didn't there must have been clues that I was picking up on somehow, but it didn't shout that to me. as evidenced by the fact that lots of people didn't see it coming and were like really taken aback by the way the story ended.
Certainly for in our time, there is a certain amount of surprise. Not everything is known in advance. We are not like the ancient Greeks, their great culture, in which all the plays had plots that everybody knew in advance. You say Antigone, and you knew exactly what happened from the myth and so on. You say Electra, everybody knew, and each writer changed a little bit here and there in order to give them some possibility of excitement. We are in a different period in which there is this surprise, and your example is fabulous. On the other hand, very often the surprise is linked to the ending, because when you see these episodes, the repetition of the episodes and the elements involved, this ambition for power, this desire to rule, and so on, and these various attempts, it's there. It is there. And you see the first one, you will see the second one, and you have this hope for what some of the writers used to call the noble falsity. The noble falsity is when this kind of ugly situations of the struggle for power, there is in a happy ending. People hope for a happy ending. Even if you know about Romeo and Juliet and you read the play 15 times and saw it 20 times, you still hope, there is something in your guts that hopes perhaps this time it will end well.
That seems really apt as a description of Game of Thrones, because right from the get-go, our expectations are being constantly dashed, right? Certain characters we think are going to live till the end of the series don't. And all kinds of other things like that. So it does seem quite reasonable to think that this is one of those fictions where it's not just our narrative expectations that are being shattered, the rug pulled out from under us, but even our genre-based expectations.
Right.
We think, oh, it's still this, really deep down, it's this kind of show. It's a show about good triumphing over evil. It's a show about the feminine triumphing over toxic masculinity. It's a show about the return of the rightful heirs to the throne, and so on and so on.
This is a specialty of 20th and 21st century literature, cinema, TV, absolutely. Because everything which follows too faithfully the rules of the genre is considered old, out of fashion, and so on. But here, let's think also about a different element, namely, we as spectators or readers, we are in two different states constantly. One is an intimate participation in the conflict, is being in their fictional universe and being emotionally part of the whole thing. And on the other hand, we are stepping back. And the two have different links with genre, because when we participate, we lose our awareness of the genre. We are in there, okay? It's like this moment in Don Quixote, this comic novel, in Don Quixote, who is a bit crazy, watches a puppet show in which a bad man does something bad, and Don Quixote, with his own sword, goes and tries to kill the puppet. Okay? It's a very good representation of our participation. We don't do as much as Don Quixote, but we participate in this way, and we feel like saying, no, don't do that, stop it, and so on. But on the other hand, it's enough to have some experience, and you step back, and what you are telling us about the Games of Thrones make you see the unexpected is a proof that one can step back enough, and sooner or later, one can see the way this particular work modulates the genres, changes it, contradicts it, and so plays a little bit around the genre. The genres are not, literature in general is not a military march.
I also think it's a source of misreading, because if you don't know that literature will do this to you, it will grab you in, and then it will purposely put this stuff that pushes you away, then you can be disoriented by literature.
You can, and you can want the wrong things. I mean, at least as far as you and I think, Ken, and I think, Tom, I would agree, right? You can want, as it were, the low-level pleasures of the character you happen to be supporting in some kind of way, rooting for. I mean, I've had students say to me about Hamlet, obviously Shakespeare thinks Hamlet is doing something wrong. Well, what do you mean? Well, he dies. They've been trained since high school to think that if an author is in favor of what the character is doing, that author will allow that character to live to a ripe old age, die in their sleep, and triumph and get everything they want. This isn't how tragedy works. It doesn't even know how real life works. And so this is a deep misunderstanding of what reading is and what it's for. And, to get back to Thomas' point about immersion and disimmersion, Nietzsche had this wonderful thought that this is a training for life. This divided state of mind where you're half in the work of fiction and half out of the work of fiction, this is the best training you could possibly give to your mind that needs to be in real life, part in and part out of its commitments.
You represented so well the pleasure and the joy of reading contemporary literature because you speak about us now. However, I must say something. For me, although I'm in literature, the Iliad bored me to death for a long time. And then I reached a certain age, and suddenly the Iliad meant a lot for me. And the first word of the Iliad is wrath, wrath. Sing, O goddess, the wrath. And because my life, your life, all of our lives are nothing to do with the struggles of these Greek so-called heroes, ambitious, nasty. But there is something which is in you, in me, the wrath. These passions, these feelings, and literature helps us experiment by identifying ourselves with things that happened long ago or in other continents, in other countries. Okay, just to give you a recent example, Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. For me, I'm not from Africa, but it just, I was there all the time. It's just incredibly immersive, if I can say. So this distance in time or space helps us to explore our values, our predicaments, our choices, and so on.
Thomas, this has been a great conversation. I told Josh, I've been puzzling about genre. He said, I got just the man for you, my old dissertation advisor, Thomas. So.
Okay, thank you so much. It was great.
Thomas Pavel from the University of Chicago on genre and smart reading. You're listening to Philosophy Talk's annual summer reading show.
Coming up, what happens when you get stuck in the middle of a book? Antonia Peacocke from Stanford has some thoughts on what she calls reader's block.
Fiction, philosophy, and befuddlement when Philosophy Talk continues. Welcome back to the program. We're thinking about reading and misreading for the summer. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, along with my Stanford colleague, Josh Landy. We've all heard about writer's block, but the philosopher Antonia Peacocke from Stanford has some thoughts on what she calls reader's block. She wrote a blog about this at our website. Antonia, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Thanks.
So, Antonia, we've been thinking about reading and misreading.
Mm-hmm.
And we gather you have something to tell us about how we're all getting it wrong.
I think that everybody has this experience once in a while of trying to read a passage of difficult text and just glazing over and realizing that you haven't paid attention for about a page and a half and you have to go back. I got obsessed with this idea that I wasn't understanding what I was reading, even though I was a good reader. I was 11. It was Homecoming by Cynthia Voigt. It's really simple, straightforward. It's made for young readers. I got obsessed with this idea that I wasn't taking it in, right? I was paying attention, I was concentrating intensely, but I couldn't find anything left over at the end of reading each sentence that sort of represented what I had just done in a way that I thought was a testifier to the way that I had understood it. And so I was stalled. I kept reading and rereading pages, but not inattentively, just obsessively. I thought that I needed to have in mind every word of the sentence that I had just read in order to count as having taken it in. It was sort of like an obsession with memory and loss in a way, because I thought that if I didn't have it in my head there when I was done with it, then I hadn't had it at all, even when I was reading it.
It's a very interesting phenomenon about reading. I mean, I think of this mainly in relation to works of fiction, like the one you're talking about, that we're constantly engaged in this act of compression.
Yeah.
Right? So you'll read a sentence and you'll essentially compress it in your mind to something a little bit smaller. And then that'll become part of a paragraph that you'll then compress in your mind something smaller. And then that'll become part of a chapter. And you have in your head a tiny little mental image of the chapter as a whole, so that you can go on and then put other chapters next to it and put what you're reading now next to it. And it sounds like that just wasn't happening for you in that case.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if that kind of picture reading both understates and overstates what it is to understand what you're reading. Because I don't think we need to understand reading as giving us any item in the end at all. Like, understanding is something you can do in the moment without having something left over, like an image, whether that's compressed or not.
So I'm listening to you, and I'm understanding you. You're not being obscure. I don't think I could repeat what you said word for word. I could repeat kind of the gist of it. I get what you're saying. Isn't reading somehow like that? I mean, there's this, I think it's Confucius or one of those Chinese texts. The swimmer learns to forget the water.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you're focusing on the water, you're really not swimming. I mean, effortless swimming forgets the water. Is reading like that, or is it not? Is reading like, what's this word? What's that word? What's that word? Or do you forget the?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think I would liken this experience to those so experts who have to perform to some extent, say, if you're an opera singer or if you're an athlete. It's not as though when you get off the field or when you get off the stage, you could state very clearly what you had just done. That's part of what it is to be fluent in an action. To be totally in it, you don't have to retain anything right afterwards to count as having acted expertly and with understanding.
I want to push back on that and see what the two of you think. Ostensibly, I'm a trained reader. And when I'm reading Proust, it's not effortless. Even when I'm reading Proust for the 10th, 14th, 15th time, it's not at all effortless. And the work is designed to be effortful, to require a certain amount of activity on our part. And there are many works like that, the kinds of fictions that Ken and I love on the television or at the movies. They often require us to do things, for example, like revisit our earlier assumptions, which have now proven to be false. Or here's another example. Think of works like Breaking Bad, which I think of as boiled frog movies or boiled frog TV shows, where you start out, everything's fine, and everything's not totally fine, but it's basically okay. And eventually you're thinking, oh my God, I'm in a moral morass. Yes. How did I get here? How did I get boiled? When did I get boiled? And what kind of mistake did I make? And in all those cases, I feel like we're strongly being invited to be active in our reading or our viewing. So it's, even though we're good readers, we're skilled readers, we're trained readers, we're doing all the right things, it's still not effortless.
Josh has this view that, a fiction represents to you often a very morally complicated universe. It may do things like invite you to root for this character who turns out to be deeply morally problematic, and it does that as a part of like a journey of self-discovery. What am I doing rooting for this character?
And very often people leap to a subsidiary conclusion, which is this is a flawed work of art. This is a dangerous work of art. It's going to make people worse, because it's going to make them think, I should be like that character. I mean, if people read 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri that way, one of Ken's and my favorite movies of that year.
See, I think that's a symptom of misreading, and I think it's a symptom of not being alive to the fact that fiction can do the kinds of things that Josh says that they do.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's overly simplistic to think that what we're doing every time we read a fiction or take in a fiction, watch a fiction, is identify with the main character in any sort of positively evaluating way, right? Like, I could be like this, or I should be like this. I think there are stories that are obviously set up, and Breaking Bad is one of these for me. Their slippery slope gets set up almost immediately. You don't have to fall down it with them, but you're there along for the ride. And I would add that you're also sort of complicit in the imaginary creation of a world that is morally flawed in certain kinds of ways. I think that complicates the picture somewhat.
I do too, and I want to ask you about so-called imaginative resistance, in which you resist. You can't. Okay, tell me a fiction in which it's all right to kill babies. No, I'm not going to go along with you, right? I'm not going to go along with it. I have an imaginative resistance to that kind of moral universe. And you try to tell me a story, you're going to fail. But this is surely not a black and white thing. This is surely not. And the
absolutely
and the extent of our imaginative resistance to possibilities that are morally alien to us can make us terrible readers of fiction.
So first of all, there's a question of whether we can't imagine certain things that are morally odious to us, or whether we just won't, whether we don't want to. But then even if we agree that there's something bad about thinking our way into a villain, let's say, and identifying with that villain, at least in the moment when we're consuming this fiction. There's a question of whether our worry is about what it will do to us in a long-lasting way, like what's the impact on my moral character from reading this, or whether there's something bad just in the event itself of imagining your way into this character. There's something bad going on just there, even if you could click your fingers and forget it right afterwards, but there'd still be some negative thing happening.
So question, and if so, how does fiction change you, right? I mean, Plato didn't want the lyric poets in the Republic making the gods look awful, right? Because he thought somehow that would make the reader of lyric poetry be awful because the gods are to be emulated. But wait a minute. They're the gods. They look awful. Why should I emulate them? Right. So the question, what does fiction do to the reader?
Right.
What kind of effect does it have on the reader? Do you have a view about that?
Well, I think my line on this, if any, would be sort of pluralistic. That is, I think fictions do all sorts of different things to the reader. I think there are some fictions which you could be looked at funny if it didn't change you fundamentally in some way after having read it. And there are other fictions which, if it changed you fundamentally after having read it, we would be worried, right? There's a whole range here, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to my mind, it also has to do with institutions of reading, is how we're being taught to read. Which gets back to the beginning of our conversation. I mean, part of it has to do with what the book is like, and part of it has to do with what the reader is like and how much effort they're putting in and whether they're distracted and so on. But I think a lot of it has to do with how we're being told to read. And if we're being told every time you pick up a book or watch a TV show, learn a lesson, emulate a character, then gosh, your Breaking Bad's going to be really dangerous.
Yeah.
But if we're being told, get in there, be active, and wrestle with the questions that are being put forward to you, then I think even imagining one's way into a villain can be not only harmless, but actually potentially morally valuable, because it allows us to expand our imagination of the kind of human beings there are, including dangerous human beings that might mess things up for everybody.
I tell you a piece of fiction, both the cinematic version and the novel version, that I despise, and I despise that people adore either of them. Gone with the Wind. I despise that movie.
Yes.
The novel is even worse. People reacted to it as like romanticizing the South, Gone with the Wind, this aristocratic way of life and all this sort of stuff. And it was full of lies. Like, here's one of the big lies, that black slaves are going to go out when Atlanta's burning and stop those damn Yankees. And I said, don't you know any history? When blacks were given the chance to rise up and defeat their master, they joined in droves and they wanted to fight, and the North wouldn't let them fight, and then finally they fight. I said, go watch Glory and forget this crap. So there is deeply morally objectionable fiction.
Not to mention Birth of a Nation.
Well, yes. What do you do with fiction like that?
I mean, one thing that people can readily endorse is contextualizing all of these things. So again, you can do something different with the text. You can see it as expressing a certain kind of attitude that is objectionable in some way. I think it's still educational and interesting to figure out how that work expresses that attitude.
I agree.
Despite not being, say, truth apt.
Yeah.
I'd rather see a world where everyone, from school days onwards, is equipped with the capacity essentially to fend off dangerous fictions like that, right? Fictions that seem to be didactic. They're trying to get us to take up a certain stance towards the realities of the world. They're deeply mistaken in a very problematic way. I want to see us being armed with certain kinds of critical reading tools that will make those works a little less dangerous.
So, Antonio, it's great to have you joining the department. I know Josh is excited to have you be part of the
Absolutely.
Philosophy and Literature program. We love having you as one of our bloggers. And don't be a stranger. Now that you're in the department, come into the studio more often.
Will do. Thanks for having me.
You can find all the works we've mentioned on the show today and more suggestions from our listeners and guests over at our community of thinkers on our website, philosophytalk.org.
Now, the only thing this guy misreads is the speedometer. It's Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. So the Mueller Report is out in bookstores, just in time for me to buy it and lug it around, put it on the table in front of me as I type stuff on my laptop. Maybe check my phone, pretend that I'm texting. Its very presence is an indictment. It makes me feel like I voted 40 times and nobody minded. It makes me my own gerrymander. If enough of us lug it around to enough coffee joints, sooner or later it might trickle up to Nancy Pelosi, and before you know it, it will be required reading in the Congress and Senate, and you'll see Mitch McConnell weeping on Fox News. Oh my God, what have I done? How could I have been so wrong? Just kidding. I don't have the book, just the PDF file. I want to read it, But boy, there's a lot of it. Many years ago, I actually did buy a copy of the Pentagon Papers. Did I ever read it? No. I also bought All the President's Men, which I did read. Saw the movie. They're both kind of dull, frankly. Not like Z. Remember that movie? Now, there's a political thriller. Also, The Battle of Algiers. Holy cow, hard-hitting. But those are movies. When I was a young man, we all had books. Books were identifiers. Carlos Castaneda, Hermann Hesse, Kafka, Borges, Orwell, Brave New World, The Stranger, The Greening of America. Never finished that one. Eric Siegel, man alive, love story. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the cover. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Kurt Vonnegut, Corbett Jerzy Kosinski, Watership Down, Philip Roth, Fahrenheit 451, On the Road, Catch-22, Always and Forever. Robert Heinlein, Malcolm X, Flannery O'Connor, Our Bodies Ourselves, Horace Catalog, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Steal This Book by Abby Hoffman, which I paid for. What a wuss. Ayn Rand couldn't do it, just couldn't do it. The Bell Jar, The Female Eunuch, those were the days when we were defined by books, not by what is in our iPod. Are we still defined by that, by the way? I ask because I do not have an iPod, so therefore I cannot be identified. I can be identified by what I'm binge watching. I could be defined by that, but not tonight, honey. I have to stay up till 3 a.m. finishing out the series. So start the book without me, leading me to a question I've asked before. Who reads books at the beach anyway? We have smartphones now. Even there, we may scroll through headlines, but the rest of the time is spent playing Candy Crush or whatever it is the kids are playing these days. So the Mueller report is a sign of hope. It could function as a status symbol. If you're lugging it around, it could mark you as a guy who cares about his country. On the other hand, if you wear a MAGA baseball cap, it could also indicate that you're a guy who cares about his country. You probably don't care much as a guy lugging around the Mueller report, because reading that indicates you're worried about the Republic, even surviving. Whereas a MAGA cap indicates you wish the Republic could open a little whoop-ass in France or whatever and maybe get rid of some of the whining libtard losers. Other than that, things are going pretty good. America's great again. In fact, also, the MAGA cap is a quick read. Glance, and you're done. Not like the Mueller report, which, near as I can tell, nobody has read. This is a new thing in these kinds of books. People have very strong opinions about it, but nobody's actually read it. Not even the journalists tasked with tackling it. Nobody has read it. Okay, Nancy Pelosi, but I doubt it. Maybe I should be a book on tape. That might improve those numbers. But the problem is, you have to have somebody who read it in order for it to be read, if you know what I mean. And you know that most of the people who read political books are political types who turn to the index first thing, looking for their own name. Well, if you're a political type, you don't want to find your name in the Mueller report. You just don't. I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of KALW, local public radio, San Francisco, and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2019.
Our executive producers are David Demarest and Tina Pamantuan.
The senior producer is Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is our director of research. Cindy Prince-Baum is our director of marketing.
Thanks also to Merle Kessler, Angela Johnston, and Lauren Schechter.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from Stanford University and from the partners at our online community of thinkers.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable.
The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you too can become a partner in our community of thinkers. I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.
It's simple. I'm raising money to hire Hillary Clinton to record an audiobook of the Mueller report. I have the Mueller report.
All right, let me start it. I'll be happy.
Let's do it.
Sure.